We're going to start out by identifying zeros from a graph, and the zeros of a function are just another word for the x-intercepts. So when we're looking at a graph, to determine the zeros of the function, you want to look and see where the graph is crossing x or touching x. And for this one, it's touching x at 0. Just pretend like this is a number line. So 0 is the answer for that one. This one's touching in 2 spots. So that's at -2 and +2. This one crosses the x-axis here and here, so that's 1 and 3. And those are also known as the solutions. So when you're looking at a factored equation, an equation that's in factored form already, you just take the opposites. So the opposite of -a is +a, and the opposite, you want the opposite of what's with x. The opposite of -b is +b. So those are the zeros of that quadratic function. You can use that information to actually develop a quadratic equation. Let's say we have y equals, you put parentheses x, and like I said before, you do the opposite. So the opposite of +2 is -2. And the opposite of -3 is +3. So y equals x times x is x squared. And then I take these two numbers and I add them together. So 3 take away 2 is a +1. And then you multiply them. -2 times 3 is -6. So if you want to write that in function notation, you can also write that as f of x equals x squared plus x minus 6. The 1 is optional. Find the solutions. To find the solutions, you have to have everything off to one side. So the first step in this first one is to add 5 to both sides. So that's going to give me x squared minus 6x plus 5 equals 0. Now I'm going to factor. So you've got 2 x's, you split them up evenly. Bring the first sign down, that's a negative, and figure out how to get to the second sign. So a negative times what equals a positive? That would be a negative. And then you work backwards. You want the factors of 5 that when you add them equals 6. Well, that would be 5 times 1, and you always put the biggest one first. Now, because we want solutions, you're going to take the opposite, and because it's equal to 0, you take the opposite of what's in the parentheses. So my solutions to this equation are 5, and the opposite of -1 is +1. Okay, this one already has 0. It's a difference of 2 squares, so I'm going to factor that. So you split up your x's. To get this negative, you have a positive times a negative. And for a difference of 2 squares, you take the square root. So the square root of 25 is 5. Now, to get the solutions, you do the opposite of what's in the parentheses. So the opposite of +5 is -5, and the opposite of -5 is +5. Now remember, if you were going to graph these points is where it would cross the x-axis. Okay, for this next one, I can factor an x out. So I have 2 x's, I took an x out, that's 1 x left over, then plus sign. I have a 17 and an x, I took the x out, so that's 17 left over. So anytime you have x on the outside of a parentheses as one of your factors, 0 is one of your answers. So 0, and the opposite of +17 is -17. Okay, the next one, I am going to split up my x's, bring down the first term, figure out how to get to the second term. So a negative times a positive will give me this negative, and I want the factors of 66 that when I subtract them equal 5. Well, the factors of 66, if you start dividing, 66 divided by 1 is 66. 66 divided by 2 is 33. 66 divided by 3 is 22. 4 doesn't work, 5 doesn't work, 6 times 11. Actually, that's it, because when I subtract those numbers, I get a 5. Okay, so you want to put the biggest number first, 11, and then 6. And because you're finding solutions equal to 0, you're doing the opposite. So the opposite of negative 11 is positive 11, and the opposite of positive 6 is negative 6. Okay, the next one, 0 equals, I'm going to make 2 sets of parentheses, split up your x's. You have a plus sign that you bring down and figure out how to get to a negative. So positive times a negative is this negative. The factors of 100 when you subtract them equal 99 are 100 times 1. The opposite of positive 100 is negative 100, and the opposite of negative 1 is positive 1. This next one, okay, you don't want a negative in front of your squared term, so I'm going to factor out a negative 1, which pretty much means change all the signs. So I'm going to change it to x squared plus 4x minus 32. I'm going to take this trinomial and factor it. Split up your x's, bring down the first sign. Positive times a negative equals this negative. The factors of 32 that when I subtract them equal 4 are 8 times 4. Remember, you're always putting the biggest one first. Now this negative 1 can't equal 0, so that's actually not part of the answer at all. So your opposite of positive 8 is negative 8, and the opposite of negative 4 is positive 4. Next one. This is a perfect square trinomial, but if you don't recognize that, you can just go ahead and factor that. Same way, just split up your x's, bring down the first sign. Everything's positive, so it's going to stay positive for everything. Factors of 25 that when you add them equal 10 are 5 times 5. Now since these are the same, you're only going to have one answer for this. It's the opposite of positive 5 is negative 5. And this next one, split up your x's. Everything's positive. The factors of 7 that when you add them equal 8 are 7 times 1. The opposite of positive 7 is negative 7, and the opposite of positive 1 is negative 1. Those are the zeros or the solutions or the roots. They're all the same thing. This real-world application is going to apply what we just learned. A fountain at a city park shoots a stream of water vertically from the ground. The function y equals negative 8x squared plus 16x models the height of the stream of water in feet after x seconds. What is the maximum height of the stream of water? So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and find the x-intercepts or the zeros or the roots. It's called the same thing, and it's what we've been doing. So I'm going to factor out a negative 8 and an x because I have an x in each one. Okay, I have a negative 8 and 2 x's. I took the negative 8 and 1 x out, so that's 1 left over. And then you divide. 16 divided by negative 8 is negative 2, and you took the x out. So that means it's crossing the x-axis at 0 and 2, based on what we talked about previously. Now the height, the maximum, is always talking about the vertex. And the vertex will be halfway between the x-intercepts. the axis of symmetry will be halfway between the x-intercepts. So halfway between 0 and 2 is 1. So 1 is the x value of my vertex. Now I want to go ahead and plug it in, the 1 into this equation. So, or the original one, it doesn't matter which one. So negative 8 times 1 squared plus 16 times 1. That's negative 8 plus 16. That equals 8. That's the y value of your vertex. Now if you're reading this, it's feet after x seconds, so x is the seconds, that's the time. And the function is the height, so that's the height. So the maximum height of the stream of water is 8 feet. At what time does a stream of water reach its maximum height? Well, that's the seconds here. 1 second. For how many seconds does a stream of water appear above the ground? Well, just think about it. If it takes 1 second to get to the maximum height and then it goes back down till you get to the ground and it's symmetrical, that means it's going to be another 1 second. So that's 2 seconds. Identify a reasonable domain and range for the situation. Well, the domain is the x value and the range of the y values. Okay, so for the domain, since we said the x's were seconds, it could be 0 seconds. Well, it can be 0 seconds, but it could be like 0.1 seconds. So x is between 0 and the maximum number of seconds that it was on the ground, up in the air until it reached the ground, was 2 seconds. The range is the height. Well, obviously you could start out on the ground and the highest it gets was 8 feet. So the range is between 0 and 8.